what is, in fact, all over social media, people are asking, why would anybody embrace fascism? I mean, because that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about fascism. There's this worldwide movement toward fascism.
To the question Thom posits, the short answer is yes, and in pieces. For example, Florida is clearly being run by a dictator. DeSantis acts without any constraints. He has stripped counties and cities of their sovereignty. He is criminalizing children, their parents, and teachers. He is infringing on the First Amendment with impunity. And he is freely neglecting crumbling infrastructure, out-of-control housing and energy inflation as he allows corporations to run rampant in each market. In other GOP states, the situation is largely the same. Corporations are running without constraint, while ordinary citizens are being stripped of their rights. In brief, politically, the U.S. is a patchwork of extreme authoritarianism, we could call it fascism, to more or less functioning republics, that is to say, states that are run as democracies. Let's run down the list of the pillars of capitalism from none other than the IMF in their article, What is Capitalism? Keep these definitions handy as reference. Private property, which allows people to own tangible assets such as land and houses, and intangible assets such as stocks and bonds. Self-interest, through which people act in pursuit of their own good, without regard to socio-political pressure. Nonetheless, these uncoordinated individuals end up benefiting society as if, in the words of Smith, they were guided by an invisible hand. Competition through firms' freedom to enter and exit markets maximizes social welfare, that is, the joint welfare of both producers and consumers. A market mechanism that determines prices in a decentralized manner through interactions between buyers and sellers. Prices, in return, allocate resources which naturally seek the highest reward, not only for goods and services, but for wages as well. The freedom to choose with respect to consumption, production, and investment. Dissatisfied customers can buy different products. Investors can pursue more lucrative ventures. Workers can leave their jobs for better pay. And last but not least, the limited role of government to protect the rights of private citizens and maintain an orderly environment that facilitates proper functioning of markets. In the economy, we live in blatant contradiction between what conservative economists have insisted for 80 years is necessary to remain free and prosperous, and the outcome their policies have achieved. Despite 40 years of neoliberalism, itself subject to turbulent and conflicting definition, the economy is arguably not even capitalist. The U.S. economy is bursting with examples of monopoly, oligopoly, and near monopsony, and your intrepid ghost faced an overwhelming choice of vibrant examples of uncapitalism. So, I gotta say, free unmarket. But one cannot go wrong by examining conservative domination of the media. Nationally, conservative media has a dominant grip. Fox and notorious outlets like Daily Wire get the limelight, but it is Sinclair Broadcast Group that exercises centralized control of content aired on TV and radio stations everywhere in the U.S. It is a single point of control of what can be, what cannot be, and what must be aired for the entire nation. It is in one man's hands. And the champions of this utter dysfunction are none other than business and the rich. Ironically, it is the left that has been defending many of the pillars, in particular the claim to mutual benefit. To summarize, today is a hellscape of incoherent and contradictory assertions, lies, tyranny, and economic, political, and social ruin by the hand of the very bulwark against chaos and instability. At this point, it's natural to ask, how did we get here? Or even, why did we get here? The generic story is corporate and billionaire dark money seeking business and tax advantage, but this fails to convey just how coordinated, institutionalized, and endemic conservatism is, or how methodical it is in its purpose. Moreover, it is a movement that has been dedicated to this purpose for 50 years. I'm going to work backwards to answer this question. In order to push outward from what is generally known to what may be less widely known, right back to the impulse that defined today's conservatism. For many, Reagan and Thatcher are seen as the godparents of modern conservatism, but both of them, rising to power in parallel, were espousing a uniform ideology, that of neoliberalism. In the U.S., evangelical extremism and Nixon's Southern strategy were added into the mix. Charles Koch took direct interest in the economic ideas of Buchanan, Friedman, and the Chicago School in 1970, well before Maggie O'Ron gained office. Buchanan also proposed the idea that protest on campuses during the 60s and 70s was for economic gain. It's impeccable logic. Not being killed or maimed in a war everyone hated did have very strong positive economic consequences for the people protesting. I will grant him that point. Anything to get at those commies, trying to destroy civilization by keeping people from dying in a war nobody wanted. Brilliant ideation. Some may know of Lewis Powell's infamous memo that rallied corporations and wealth to work collectively to seize the means of governance, and within it lists the set of grievances and fears taken as fact that required urgent collective dedicated action. Written in 1971, it quotes none other than Milton Friedman. Conservatism still uses the same arguments without change since Powell's memo of 1971. The horror show irony here is different factions within today's conservatism are themselves in open war with Western values and with market economies. Different factions reject the concept of a secular state, of republics, or even of a modern state altogether, with many of the same rejecting market economies, instead preferring monopoly control.
The American middle class in 1951 was growing faster than any middle class had ever grown in the history of the world. By that point, 1951, about half of us were in the middle class. That had never happened before in any country. And Kirk and others around him, particularly Buckley, predicted that if the middle class continued to grow, we would hit a point where the average working person would have enough wealth that they would have the leisure time to engage in politics, which had traditionally been the sport of the rich. And that once the average American started getting politically active, it would produce chaos. there would be riots in the streets, the country would be on fire, the proletariat would rise up and demand that the rich be taxed to death and all that money be redistributed, and that would be the end of society, the end of democracy, the end of America. Now, when Kirk published that in 1951, there was only a small number of conservatives who took him seriously. They thought he was a crackpot. I mean, Barry Goldwater loved it. William F. Buckley loved it. But Dwight Eisenhower in 1954 said of Kirk, not specifically, but of the billionaires who were funding him, actually, the Hunt brothers, he said, or supporting him, he said, you know, their numbers are small and they are stupid. That was in 54. But then came the 1960s. And so by the end of the 60s, in addition to those things, there were a number of high-profile police killings of unarmed black people that then provoked riots, and so you had cities on fire. So you had women burning their bras, or at least that, you know, that was the media narrative. You had black people burning cities. You had the war in Vietnam. By 1967, you had students burning draft cards. I mean, this was at that point, you know, the conservatives. And the labor movement was in full swing. 1970 was the peak. 5,716 strikes in that 1 year. Over 3 million workers walked out in 1970. And as that happened, these four things happened. These four movements all happened in the 60s. Conservatives looked back at what Russell Kirk had written and said, "My God, this guy was a prophet. The country is in flames. The young people are rebelling. The women and minorities no longer know their place, for God's sake. We've got to do something."
I don't think a century ago that right-wing extremists viewed the butcher, the baker, the plumber, and the carpenter enjoying a middle-class life as a threat itself. When the wealthy became convinced that Russell Kirk and Buckley were onto something, they sprung into action. In short order, Lewis Powell Jr., then a corporate lawyer, wrote his now infamous memo. He then proposes that business interests and the wealthy collaborate to seize the means of governance. Yeah, I'm putting it in those terms because that's what it is. And boy, did they jump into it. The Koch family is the best known leader and organizer of the entire process. All told, they managed to round up a few hundred fellow like-minded billionaires and companies to spawn an entire industry of think tanks, foundations, nonprofits, and societies to pull American politics and society into a direction they wanted to go in. We've all heard names involved in this industry: the Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, the Federalist Society, ALEC, Americans for Prosperity, the Bradley Foundation, on and on and on. There are literally hundreds of these little organizations that billionaires can fund and wash money through. They use it to buy the GOP. They use it to select conservative judges. They use it to write laws that get rubber stamped by many state legislatures, especially the ones in Republican-run states. And they fund media empires to spread their own ideas, as well as promoting them within colleges and universities. Unlike the fanatics of a century ago, today's billionaires, ring-led by Charles Koch, with Peter Thiel representing the next generation, have relentlessly pursued their economic and political war. They have funded it with hundreds of millions of dollars every year for over a half century. And while it is centered in the US and UK, it is also global and entrenched as establishment. So while there may be Nazis, ANCAP libertarians, religious, sexist, and racial bigots amongst them, the essential glue holding them together is the thesis that the middle class must be exploited and crushed. So, would I call them fascists? I don't know. You can make up your own mind about it. The way I look at it is they're doing one better than the guys of a century ago. They're not after just a few groups. They hate everyone. The best historical comparisons may not be 1930s Germany or Italy, but Cambodia. Under Pol Pot,